The Soviets called it impossible. Their military leaders laughed when they first heard about it. But for 4 years, an American plane flew directly over Moscow, photographing their most classified military sites, and there wasn't a single thing they could do to stop it. This is the story of the U-2 spy plane and how it made the most powerful military on Earth look completely helpless. In the early 1950s, the Cold War was getting worse by the day. The United States had a massive problem. They knew the Soviets were building something big behind the Iron Curtain. Nuclear weapons, missile sites, military bases. But they had no idea where these installations were or how many existed. Traditional reconnaissance methods weren't working. Spy networks were being discovered and eliminated. Satellite technology didn't exist yet, and flying regular aircraft over Soviet territory was basically suicide. The Soviets would shoot them down before they could see anything useful. America was flying blind against an enemy that could potentially destroy them, and nobody knew what to do about it. The intelligence gap was terrifying. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, the CIA and military intelligence were desperately trying to figure out what the Soviet Union was doing inside their borders. Every method they tried either failed or got people killed. Ground intelligence was almost impossible. The Soviet Union was a closed society. They had informants everywhere, secret police monitoring everyone, and brutal consequences for anyone caught spying. The few agents the US managed to get inside were quickly identified and disappeared. The Soviet counterintelligence network was just too good. Border reconnaissance flights were attempted using modified bombers that would fly along the edges of Soviet airspace, trying to peek inside with cameras. But these planes couldn't see far enough inland to spot anything important. All the critical military installations were deep inside Soviet territory, hundreds of miles from any border. The Soviets knew this, and specifically built their most sensitive sites in locations that were impossible to observe from outside. Even worse, the few times American or British aircraft accidentally or intentionally crossed into Soviet airspace, they were immediately engaged by Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft systems. Several planes were shot down. Crews were captured or killed. The Soviets had radar coverage and interceptor aircraft stationed all across their territory. Any conventional aircraft flying at normal altitudes would be detected within minutes and destroyed shortly after. The US military tried using high-altitude balloons equipped with cameras, floating them over Soviet territory and hoping they'd drift across important sites. This operation, called Project Genetrix, launched hundreds of balloons starting in 1956. It was a disaster. The Soviets shot most of them down. The ones that survived often malfunctioned or drifted off course. The few that successfully crossed Soviet territory and were recovered provided some photographs, but the results were random and unreliable. You couldn't aim a balloon. You just released it and hoped for the best. President Eisenhower was getting increasingly worried. Intelligence estimates about Soviet bomber and missile capabilities varied wildly. Some analysts claimed the Soviets were rapidly building a massive bomber fleet that would soon outnumber American forces. This became known as the bomber gap. Others warned about a missile gap, suggesting the Soviets were deploying intercontinental ballistic missiles faster than the US. But nobody actually knew the truth. Were these gaps real or imaginary? Were the Soviets actually ahead, or was this all paranoia? The problem was that without hard evidence, defense planners had to assume the worst-case scenario. This meant spending enormous amounts of money building weapons to counter threats that might not even exist. It also meant the constant risk of miscalculation. If you don't know what your enemy actually has, you might either underestimate them and get destroyed, or overestimate them and start a war based on false assumptions. Eisenhower needed facts, real photographs of Soviet military installations, accurate counts of bombers, missiles, submarines, and troops. He needed to know what was actually behind the Iron Curtain. But in 1953 and 1954, there was simply no way to get that information. Every technology available at the time had fundamental limitations that made deep reconnaissance of the Soviet Union impossible. The Air Force proposed various solutions, but they all had fatal flaws. Building faster bombers wouldn't help because speed alone couldn't outrun radar detection and missiles. Armoring planes more heavily just made them slower and easier targets. Stealth technology as we know it today didn't exist. Electronic countermeasures could confuse some radar systems, but weren't reliable enough for deep penetration missions over the most heavily defended airspace in the world. Some military leaders suggested that the only way to know what the Soviets had was to actually go to war, which was obviously insane. Others recommended just accepting uncertainty and building as many weapons as possible, regardless of what the Soviets were doing. But Eisenhower, who had commanded Allied forces in World War II, understood that intelligence wins wars. He knew that understanding your enemy's actual capabilities is more valuable than 1,000 bombers built to counter imaginary threats. So he authorized one of the most ambitious and secretive aircraft development programs in history. The mission was simple, but seemed impossible. Build a plane that could fly over the Soviet Union, photograph military installations with incredible detail, and do it at an altitude so high that Soviet fighters and missiles couldn't reach it. Enter Clarence Kelly Johnson and his team at Lockheed's Skunk Works. Johnson was already legendary in aviation circles for designing breakthrough aircraft. When the CIA approached him in 1954 with the challenge of creating an aircraft that could fly higher than any Soviet weapon could reach, he knew it would require throwing out almost everything conventional aircraft design assumed. The key insight was brutal simplicity. To fly at extreme altitudes, the aircraft needed to be as light as possible while having enormous wings to generate lift in the thin air above 70,000 feet. Everything else was secondary: speed, weapons, armor, even basic safety features. All of it had to be sacrificed for altitude and range. Johnson's team designed what looked more like a powered glider than a military aircraft. The U-2 had wings that spanned over 100 feet, but weighed almost nothing. The fuselage was narrow and fragile. The entire aircraft was built from lightweight aluminum. There was no ejection seat in early models because it would add too much weight. The landing gear was unconventional, essentially just a pair of wheels along the center line of the fuselage, with small outrigger wheels under the wings that would fall off after takeoff. It was so unstable on the ground that it needed vehicles to chase it down the runway during landing, but it worked. In August 1955, the prototype U-2 reached 70,000 feet on its first flight. This was higher than any operational aircraft in the world. More importantly, it was higher than any Soviet fighter or surface-to-air missile could reach at that time. The Soviets had radar that could detect the U-2, but detection didn't matter if they couldn't do anything about it. The CIA established a secret base in Nevada to train pilots and test the aircraft. They recruited military pilots but made them resign from active duty and become civilians, giving the government plausible deniability if anything went wrong. The pilots had to learn to fly an aircraft that behaved unlike anything else. At 70,000 feet, the air is so thin that the margin between stalling speed and maximum speed is only about 10 knots. Fly too slow and you drop out of the sky. Fly too fast and the aircraft tears itself apart. Pilots called this the coffin corner, and they had to stay in it for hours at a time. The cameras installed in the U-2 were equally revolutionary. They used specialized lenses and film that could photograph objects on the ground with incredible resolution from altitudes above 13 miles. During test flights over the United States, the cameras could clearly capture individual cars, read license plates, and identify specific aircraft models at military bases. If this level of detail could be achieved over Soviet territory, it would provide exactly the intelligence Eisenhower needed. In July 1956, the first operational U-2 flights over the Soviet Union began. The missions were launched from bases in Pakistan and Germany, carefully planned to overfly specific target areas during daylight hours when photography would be clearest. The first flight crossed into Soviet airspace near Leningrad, continued over multiple military installations, and exited near the Black Sea after photographing several suspected bomber bases. The results were stunning. When the film was developed and analyzed, photo interpreters could count individual aircraft on the ground, identify specific models, and determine the exact layout of military facilities. In a single flight, the U-2 provided more detailed intelligence about Soviet military capabilities than the entire spy network had gathered in years. And the Soviets knew it was happening. Their radar tracked the U-2 from the moment it entered their airspace. Air defense commanders scrambled fighters to intercept it. MiG-17 and MiG-19 fighters climbed as high as they could, but they maxed out around 55,000 feet, nearly 3 miles below the U-2. Pilots could see the contrail of the American spy plane far above them, completely out of reach. It must have been incredibly frustrating. Surface-to-air missiles were launched, but they couldn't reach the necessary altitude either. The SA-1 and SA-2 missile systems that the Soviets had deployed were designed to shoot down bombers flying at 40 to 50,000 feet. The U-2 was flying 15 to 20,000 feet higher. The missiles would arc upward, run out of energy, and fall back to Earth, while the U-2 continued calmly along its route. Soviet military leaders reported these incursions to their government. They knew American aircraft were violating their airspace and photographing sensitive military sites, but there was nothing they could do except watch it happen. Publicly, the Soviet government remained mostly silent about the overflights because admitting them would mean admitting they were powerless to stop them. It was humiliating. The CIA flew more missions. Throughout late 1956 and into 1957, U-2 aircraft crisscrossed the Soviet Union, photographing everything of military significance. They flew over Moscow itself, directly over the Kremlin, taking pictures of the heart of Soviet power. They photographed nuclear weapons facilities, submarine bases, missile test sites, and airfields. Each mission brought back thousands of images that analysts pored over in incredible detail. The intelligence revolution was immediate. Within months, the CIA had detailed maps of Soviet military infrastructure. They could count bombers and see that the feared bomber gap was a myth. The Soviets didn't have nearly as many long-range bombers as feared. They found early missile development sites, but could see that Soviet ICBM deployment was still in early stages. The missile gap was also largely imaginary. This intelligence completely changed American defense planning. Instead of building weapons to counter exaggerated threats, the US could now make informed decisions based on actual Soviet capabilities. Billions of dollars were redirected to programs that addressed real threats rather than imaginary ones. And perhaps most importantly, having accurate intelligence reduced the risk of war based on miscalculation. But the Soviets weren't sitting still. They knew they had a problem, and they were working desperately to solve it. Soviet designers were pushing their surface-to-air missile systems to reach higher altitudes. They were developing new radar systems to track high-altitude targets more effectively. And they were training specialized units whose only job was to shoot down the U-2. American intelligence knew this race was happening. Every U-2 mission carried risk. CIA analysts estimated that eventually Soviet technology would advance enough to reach the U-2's altitude. It was just a question of when. President Eisenhower was personally cautious about authorizing missions, knowing that each flight risked a diplomatic incident if the plane was shot down. But the intelligence was too valuable to stop. By 1960, the U-2 program had been flying over the Soviet Union for nearly 4 years. It had provided unprecedented insight into Soviet military capabilities and had completely reshaped American understanding of the Cold War balance of power. Dozens of missions had been flown successfully, but the technology gap was closing. On May 1, 1960, CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers took off from Peshawar, Pakistan, in a U-2 on a mission that would fly across the entire Soviet Union, photographing multiple military sites before landing in Norway. It was an ambitious flight path, deeper into Soviet territory than most previous missions. Everything seemed normal as Powers crossed into Soviet airspace near the Afghan border and headed north. His cameras were operating correctly. He was maintaining altitude at around 70,000 feet. But this time, the Soviets were ready. Soviet air defense forces had been preparing for this moment for years. They had deployed upgraded SA-2 missiles with improved guidance systems and more powerful rocket motors. They had practiced intercept procedures specifically designed for high-altitude targets. And on this particular day, they had advance warning of the U-2's route from signals intelligence. As Powers flew over Sverdlovsk, an industrial city in central Russia, Soviet missile crews launched a salvo of SA-2 missiles. The first missile didn't hit Powers directly, but detonated close enough that the explosion damaged the aircraft. The U-2 began breaking apart. Powers tried to activate the aircraft's self-destruct mechanism to destroy the classified equipment and cameras, but the plane was tumbling and he was being thrown around the cockpit. He managed to bail out and parachuted to the ground, where he was immediately captured by Soviet military forces. The Soviets had finally done it. They had shot down the untouchable spy plane. Initially, the American government issued a cover story. They claimed a NASA weather research aircraft had gone missing after the pilot reported oxygen problems. NASA even rolled out a U-2 painted with NASA markings and claimed the missing plane had accidentally drifted over Soviet territory while the pilot was unconscious from hypoxia. It was a plausible story designed to give the US plausible deniability. But then Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev revealed that Powers was alive, in custody, and had confessed to being a CIA pilot on an espionage mission. Khrushchev also displayed wreckage from the U-2, including the intact cameras and undeveloped film showing Soviet military installations. The American cover story collapsed instantly. Eisenhower was forced to publicly admit that the US had been conducting spy flights over the Soviet Union for years. The diplomatic fallout was severe. A planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev in Paris was cancelled. US-Soviet relations, which had been slowly improving, deteriorated dramatically. Powers was put on trial in Moscow, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The invincible U-2 program over the Soviet Union was finished. But here's the thing that often gets overlooked. For 4 years, from 1956 to 1960, the U-2 spy plane program was one of the most successful intelligence operations in history. It flew dozens of missions deep into Soviet territory, photographing whatever it wanted, and the Soviets couldn't do anything about it. Those 4 years of intelligence gathering fundamentally changed the Cold War. The photographs proved that the Soviet military was powerful, but not supernaturally advanced. The bomber gap and missile gap that had driven American military planning turned out to be largely fictional. The Soviets had significant capabilities, but they weren't ahead of the United States in the arms race. This knowledge allowed American leaders to make rational decisions about defense spending and military strategy instead of panicking about imaginary threats. The U-2 program also drove technological advancement on both sides. The American push to fly higher led to innovations in lightweight materials, high-altitude engines, and reconnaissance cameras that influenced aviation design for decades. The Soviet determination to shoot down the U-2 accelerated their surface-to-air missile development, which eventually led to highly capable air defense systems. Francis Gary Powers was eventually released in 1962 in a prisoner exchange for Soviet KGB Colonel Rudolf Abel. He returned to the United States, where public opinion was mixed. Some saw him as a hero who served his country in dangerous circumstances. Others criticized him for not destroying the aircraft and getting captured alive. Powers maintained that he followed his training and did the best he could in an impossible situation. He later worked as a test pilot and helicopter news reporter before dying in a helicopter crash in 1977. In 2000, decades after his death, Powers was posthumously awarded the Prisoner of War Medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the National Defense Service Medal, officially recognizing his service. The U-2 aircraft itself is still flying today, more than 70 years after its first flight. The design has been updated with modern engines, avionics, and sensors, but it's still fundamentally the same aircraft Kelly Johnson designed in 1954. The U.S. Air Force currently operates U-2s for high-altitude reconnaissance missions around the world. The fact that this aircraft is still relevant in an era of satellites and drones says something about how revolutionary the design was. The lesson here goes beyond just spy planes and Cold War history. The U-2 program succeeded because it identified a specific problem, found a creative solution that exploited a temporary technological advantage, and executed the plan brilliantly while that advantage lasted. Johnson and his team didn't try to build a perfect aircraft that could do everything. They built an aircraft that could do one thing better than anyone else, and they accepted all the compromises that came with that focus. For 4 years, American intelligence flew circles around the Soviet Union with impunity. They photographed Moscow, military bases, nuclear facilities, and submarine ports. The Soviets detected every single flight, scrambled fighters, launched missiles, and couldn't touch them. It was the ultimate humiliation for a superpower that prided itself on military strength. And it fundamentally changed how both sides understood each other, which probably made the Cold War less dangerous than it otherwise would have been. Hit subscribe if you want more Cold War stories like this.